The knock came just before dusk, 3 timid taps against the heavy oak doors of Boone Whitmore's ranch. The giant of Dry Creek, a man whose silence carried more weight than a sermon, found a little girl standing there, barefoot and trembling. Her eyes were wide with dust and fear. "They beat my mama. She's dying," she whispered. In that breath, the air shifted because everyone in town knew Boone didn't take in strays, didn't meddle, didn't care. But that night, his next move would shake Dry Creek to its bones and rewrite the story they told about monsters and men. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The wind over Dry Creek carried that uneasy silence only the desert could birth, where every sound seemed too loud, every shadow too long. At the edge of Boone Whitmore's ranch, the sky burned copper and ash, the kind of dusk that swallowed everything soft. He sat in his chair, boots planted, hat tilted low, when the knock came, 3 faint taps, so small they almost sounded like the ghost of a memory. Boone didn't move at first. No one ever came this far, not since he'd walled himself off from the world and its endless noise. The knock came again, sharper this time, trembling through the wood like a cry for help dressed in courage. He rose, each step echoing through the hollow house, and opened the heavy door to a sight that made even a battle-hardened man falter. A little girl stood there barefoot, her dress torn, streaked with dust and something darker. Her hair clung to her face, her eyes wide, not with the blankness of fear, but with the kind of knowing no child should carry. Boone's shadow swallowed her whole as he looked down, and for a heartbeat neither spoke. Then, in a voice that cracked like brittle glass, she said, "They beat my mama. She's dying." The words slipped between them, heavy and raw, and Boone felt something old stir beneath his ribs, something he thought the war and whiskey had long since buried. Behind her, the plains stretched empty, the last threads of sunlight dying over the horizon, leaving her small form trembling in the chill. Boone glanced past her shoulder, half expecting someone or something to follow, but the land was still, save for the sighing wind and the distant cry of a hawk. He could have shut the door. He almost did. For years, he'd made a promise to himself. No more saving, no more getting involved, no more bleeding for a world that only knew how to take. Yet the girl's eyes, gray and stormy like a summer sky before the lightning, held him there. He saw in them a reflection of a life once his own, before grief hollowed him out. "Where's your mother?" he finally asked, his voice a graveled whisper. She pointed east, toward the dark line of the old mill. "There," she said. "They left her there." Boone's jaw tightened. He looked down at his calloused hands, at the scars that told a story he never spoke. Then he exhaled, slow, resigned, and stepped aside. "Come in," he muttered. The girl hesitated only a second before crossing the threshold. The moment she did, something in the air shifted, like the house itself had taken a breath after years of holding it in. Outside, the first stars broke through the bruised sky, cold and watchful. Boone Whitmore didn't know it yet, but that timid knock had just shattered the stillness of his exile, and before the next sunrise, every soul in Dry Creek would remember the night the giant rancher opened his door. The heat of the desert clung to Boone Whitmore's skin like guilt he couldn't wash off, each breath thick with dust and memory as he stood motionless in the doorway, staring at the dying light stretching long across the plains. Inside his chest, his heart thudded slow and heavy, echoing the silence of the ranch that had once been full of laughter and warmth but now felt like a tomb. The image of his wife flashed behind his eyes, her hair catching firelight, her soft voice whispering dreams of a family, a future that had burned away in one violent night. He'd buried her beneath the cottonwood tree out back, next to the grave of the child they never had, and ever since, he'd been a man more ghost than flesh. The girl in the yard looked small against the vastness of the land, her dress torn, her bare feet stained with dirt, clutching that broken doll as if it were the last thing tethering her to the world. Boone wanted to turn away, to close the door and let the desert swallow her whole like it had swallowed everything else he'd ever cared for. But something inside him refused, some stubborn ember that refused to die even after years of wind and grief. "Wait here," he told her, his voice rough with disuse, and turned toward the barn. His old duster hung by the door, stiff from years of sun and neglect, still smelling faintly of smoke. When he slid it on, it was like donning the weight of his past, the man he'd been before pain turned him into a shadow. The barn groaned when he pushed open the door. the familiar scent of hay and leather wrapping around him like a memory he couldn't shake. Ash, his horse, shifted in the stall, dark eyes gleaming with a knowing calm. Boone ran a hand down the animal's neck, feeling the warmth beneath his palm. The steady pulse of life that reminded him the world hadn't ended, no matter how much it should have. The saddle creaked under his weight as he cinched it tight, the motion muscle deep, automatic, like a ritual carved into his bones. Outside, the horizon bled red, the sun setting like a wound across the sky. He could almost hear the whispers from town floating on the dry wind. Boone Whitmore, the man who used to shoot faster than his shadow, the man whose heart turned to dust after the fire. They said he'd lost his soul out there in the wasteland, that he'd traded mercy for whiskey and solitude. Maybe they were right. But tonight, as he swung up into the saddle, feeling the old ache in his knees and the pulse of purpose in his chest, he knew something was shifting. The girl's eyes followed him, full of trust he didn't deserve but couldn't ignore. He tipped his hat, the faintest nod of promise, then turned his horse toward the darkening trail ahead. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and the faint whisper of fate. For the first time in years, Boone rode not to escape his past but to face it. And in the gathering dusk, the dust began to stir. The horse's hooves beat a slow, steady rhythm across the cracked earth, each thud swallowed by the vast, empty silence of the prairie. Boone Whitmore rode with the girl pressed against his back, her tiny hands clutching the worn leather of his coat as if the world behind them might still reach out and drag her away. The horizon stretched endless and merciless, the last colors of day melting into the cold blue of coming night. Dust rose around them like ghosts, curling in the air before disappearing into nothing. Boone didn't speak not because he didn't want to, but because there was nothing worth saying yet. His silence carried the weight of old regrets and unspoken prayers, the kind that belonged to men who had seen too much and said too little. He could feel the girl trembling against him, every shiver a reminder of something raw and wrong in the world. Her hair smelled faintly of smoke and dirt. Her dress, thin and torn, fluttered against the wind like the last page of a dying story. Boone's eyes scanned the horizon, hard and searching, the way a man does when he's been hunted before. Somewhere out there was the truth she carried and the danger that came with it. He guided the horse toward the east, where the land dipped low and the old mill waited, half swallowed by shadow. "What's your name?" he asked finally, his voice barely a growl against the wind. "Lena," she whispered, almost afraid to speak it aloud. "Where's your mama, Lena?" The question hung in the air for a long, aching moment. Her reply came soft, steady, too certain for a child's mouth. "Behind the mill, where no one goes." The word struck Boone harder than a bullet. That place, he remembered it well. The mill had been abandoned for years, ever since the river changed course and the workers left. It was where the drifters went to disappear, where the law turned a blind eye, where whispers of violence were carried off by the coyotes before morning. Boone's jaw clenched as the girl's voice broke again, her next words trembling through the cool night air. "They said she wouldn't last till morning." Boone's hands tightened on the reins. The past came flooding back, faces, screams, the sound of his wife's breath fading under a sky not too different from this one. He swallowed it down, forcing himself to focus on the path ahead. The prairie wind howled around them, fierce and mournful, as if trying to warn him off. But Boone had already made his choice. His coat whipped against his legs, the horse's breath came in short bursts, and the moon began to rise a pale witness to a man breaking his own vow to never save anyone again. The girl leaned her head against his back and whispered something he almost didn't hear. "Thank you." He didn't answer. He couldn't. The only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves, carrying them closer to the place where the living met the dying, and where Boone Whitmore would face the ghosts he'd buried in the dust. The mill rose out of the darkness like the bones of something long dead, its rotting timbers creaking beneath the touch of the wind. The place smelled of rust, old wheat, and ghosts' memories that refused to stay buried. Boone Whitmore dismounted, lifting Lena gently from the saddle, her small hand clutching his with the desperate trust of someone who had run out of choices. The moonlight broke through the shattered roof in trembling slivers, painting the ground in streaks of silver and ash. Boone moved slow, his boots whispering against the dirt, each step heavy with the knowledge that whatever waited inside wasn't just another broken soul, it was a piece of his past come to collect a debt. The girl pointed toward the corner where the shadows were thickest. Boone's chest tightened when he saw her, the woman lying there, half covered in a torn blanket, blood matted in her hair, her breath shallow and ragged. She wasn't old, maybe 30, but life had carved its story deep into her face. Boone knelt beside her, his rough hands hovering over the bruises that ran down her arms like dark vines. For a moment, she didn't move. Then her eyes fluttered open, and even through the haze of pain, she recognized him. "Boone!" she rasped, her lips cracked, voice barely more than air. He leaned closer, his hat shadowing the worry in his eyes. "You know me?" Her trembling fingers reached toward him, stopping just short of his chest. "You were his friend once." Boone froze, the words slicing through the quiet like a blade. "Whose friend?" he asked, though part of him already knew. Her answer came on a broken breath, fragile but sharp enough to cut him open. "Clay Rourke." Boone's jaw tightened, his heartbeat drumming hard in his ears. Sheriff Clay Rourke, the man who'd pulled him from the battlefield, the man who'd once sworn that justice had a place in Dry Creek, the man he'd trusted when trust still meant something. Boone felt the heat rise under his collar, a familiar fire he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "He did this?" he asked quietly, his voice low and dangerous. The woman's eyes closed, tears slipping through the grime on her cheeks. "Said she stole something. Said he'd make her an example." Boone looked at Lena, the child trembling in the cold, her face buried in his coat. He understood now the terror, the pleading, the road that led them here. He reached for his canteen, tilting a few drops of water to the woman's lips, though he knew it wouldn't fix what had been done. "Rest," he said softly. "You're safe now." But he knew it was a lie. There was no safety left in Dry Creek. Not while Clay Rourke wore the badge. Boone stood slowly, the old floorboards groaning beneath his boots. His eyes lingered on the woman, on the pain carved into her body by a man he once called brother. The wind swept through the broken mill, carrying with it the scent of dust and blood and retribution. Somewhere deep inside Boone Whitmore, something began to wake a fire that had slept too long, waiting for a reason to burn again. The night settled heavy over the Whitmore ranch, thick with the scent of blood, whiskey, and rain that threatened but never came. Inside, the only sound was the labored breathing of the woman lying on Boone's bed and the slow pacing of the man who couldn't stand still. Boone Whitmore's boots thudded against the floorboards, his steps uneven, like a man walking the line between redemption and ruin. He'd seen too many nights like this, nights where someone lay half dead, and he was left wondering whose hand had truly done the killing. The lantern light threw his shadow long across the wall, bending and stretching with every restless turn. He ran a hand through his graying hair, roughened fingers brushing the old scar above his brow, a mark from another lifetime under another man's command. Clay Rourke. Boone's jaw tightened at the thought of that name, the way Rourke used to stand tall in his shiny boots, spouting words about justice while his men did the devil's work. Boone had followed him once, believed him when he said the raids on the border towns were righteous, that the people they burned out were thieves and killers. But Boone had seen the truth before long. He'd watched the innocent die. He'd smelled the smoke of homes that never should have burned. And when he'd finally turned his back on it, Rourke had told him, "You can walk away, Whitmore, but you'll never wash it off." And he hadn't. Years later, every scar on his hand still felt wet with ghosts. The woman on his bed stirred, a soft moan slipping from her throat, and Boone turned toward her, something pained flickering in his eyes. He'd seen too many like her broken by men who thought their power was law. He poured another dipper of water and touched it to her lips. "You hold on," he muttered, though it sounded more like a plea than an order. Behind him, Lena sat quietly in the corner, her small frame bundled in one of his coats, her eyes too knowing for a child. She didn't speak, but she watched him the way someone watches a wounded animal, curious, cautious, full of pity. Boone tried to ignore it, but every time their eyes met, he felt something shift. He'd been alone too long, carrying his guilt like a badge no one could see. But this girl, this child who had every reason to fear men like him, looked at him with trust, unspoken, unearned, and somehow heavier than all his sins. He sank into the chair by the window, rubbing his face as the wind howled outside, rattling the shutters like old bones. He thought of his wife, how she used to sing when storms came, her voice soft enough to drown out the thunder. She'd told him once that not every wound was meant to bleed forever. Maybe she'd been wrong. Or maybe tonight, sitting in the half-light of his own guilt, Boone finally began to wonder if there was still time to prove her right. Boone Whitmore's boots scuffed against the rough floorboards, a steady, restless rhythm that seemed to echo the storm raging in his mind as he circled the room. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, dragging the desert's chill into the corners of the dimly lit cabin. But it was nothing compared to the gale inside him, memories he had tried for years to bury clawing their way back. He remembered the border raids like they had been yesterday. Towns scorched, homes reduced to ash, families dragged into the dust, and the lawman Clay Rourke among them smirking as they delivered punishment under the banner of justice. Boone's hands itched, not for the gun he carried now, but for the retribution he had long denied himself. The punishment he should have taken for the innocent blood spilled by his obedience. His chest tightened with every recollection, the ghosts of those nights pressing in, whispering accusations he had no words to answer. The woman on the bed stirred again, a weak gasp that carried both pain and life, and he felt the knot in his gut twist tighter. She was the embodiment of all those he had failed. All those faces burned into his memory, now staring at him with fragile hope. Lena, the little girl, remained silent in the corner, her tiny hands clutching the coat that swallowed her slight frame, her gray eyes unwavering as if she could see through the walls of his guilt and into the raw, unvarnished truth of the man he had become. Her quiet presence pierced him more sharply than any memory, a reminder that not all innocence was gone, that trust could still exist even in the wake of darkness. Boone's voice, rough as gravel and heavy with years of regret, broke the silence as he muttered to no one in particular. "How many more nights, huh? How many more lives before it ends?" His gaze drifted toward the ceiling, where shadows twisted like old memories, and he felt the weight of every command obeyed, every order executed, every soul lost because he had followed rather than fought. He crouched beside the woman, checking her pulse, offering sips of water, and yet each gesture seemed both insufficient and necessary, a small penance for sins that would never wash away. Lena's soft presence, her unspoken trust, became a tether anchoring him to the present, a fragile lifeline between what he had done and what he might still do right. Boone paused, knuckles pressed to his eyes, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and in the quiet hum of the night, he made a silent vow. Whatever storm awaited him outside, whatever vengeance or justice demanded his hand, he would face it differently this time. He would protect, not obey. He would save, not destroy. The ghosts of his past roared in protest, but the small, battered forms in his room, the woman struggling for each breath, the girl who refused to blink away the fear, were louder. Louder than any guilt he carried, louder than the weight of the man he once was. And Boone Whitmore knew, deep in his scarred and weary heart, that this night would be the first step toward redemption, the first spark of light in a long, dark reckoning. The sun had barely climbed high enough to burn the morning's chill off the prairie, when the gravel road to the Whitmore ranch trembled under the approach of hooves and the hard clatter of men who fancied themselves the law. Sheriff Clay Rourke rode up the lane with the bearing of a man who'd learned to wear cruelty like a second uniform. His hat angled just so, leather gloves immaculate, and a smile like a rusted blade twisted at the corner of his mouth. 2 deputies flanked him, broad and silent, boots and belts polished, faces flat as if practice had hardened them. They reined near the fence. The animals shifted, uneasy at the tautness in the air. Boone met them on the porch, the house dark behind him where the woman breathed shallow and Lena clutched a coat. Rourke dismounted slow, every motion meant to be watched. "Morning, Whitmore," he said, civility dripping like honey over a knife. "Heard you had guests." His gaze lingered on the woman in the window with a pleasure that chilled Boone. Boone stepped down, the ranch air closing around him like a second skin. "She stays," Boone said, low and steady. Rourke's smile thinned. He leaned in, predatory. "We'll be taking her back to town," he declared, voice smooth as varnish. "Runaway. Thief. My duty." The word duty tasted false. Boone's jaw tightened. The scar above his brow pulled like a muscle remembering an old hurt. Lena's small face set with something fierce that made Boone's hands unclench. Rourke closed the distance a step, boots crushing the gravel, and spread his hands as if the ground belonged to him. Boone met his movement without swagger, just the weight of a man who had buried his own violence and now refused to dig it up for someone else's lie. There was history in the way they watched each other, 100 nights of shared fires and louder silences, a friendship once ironclad that had cracked under orders and blood. The town of Dry Creek, though mostly unseen from the ridge, felt present in the pause. Windows shaded, eyes peering from behind curtains, gossip like a living thing waiting to feed. "You come for her," Boone warned, voice dropping to a rumble that made the porch board seem to listen. "You best not come back breathing." The deputy's fingers drifted to holsters. Polite threats practiced 100 times, and one of them hesitated, an old doubt flickering across his expression that betrayed he'd once known what mercy was. Rourke's face hardened, the smile died, and something colder took its place, a shadow that had eaten compromise long ago. In that suspended breath, no hand moved to draw. To shoot would be to ignite a reckoning neither could predict. The morning wind held the moment like a held breath, and Boone felt the weight of history, his own and the town's, press into his chest, stirring a resolve he'd pretended dead. Beyond the ridge a hawk called, and the sound felt like an answer, as if the land itself acknowledged the new line being drawn: protect or obey. The warning hung there, heavy as iron, and every man on that road felt the truth of it settle in their bones. Night settled over the prairie, and Boone Whitmore moved through his house with the steady, practical motions of a man preparing for inevitable trouble. He trimmed lamps and laid rifles by the door. Cold metal he trusted more than prayers. Lena slept against her mother, the woman's breath shallow but keeping time, and each fragile inhale tightened the knot in Boone's chest. He checked the guns with hands that remembered war, not for glory but because knowing might spare a life. Stars bled into dawn as memories rose, the raids, the orders, the homes that had burned while men in boots called it justice. Boone let those memories teach him. They did not excuse him, but they shaped the choice now set in his bones. The hoofbeats that answered the light came urgent. Clay, Rourke, and 2 deputies, riding with the arrogance of men used to obedience. They dismounted like judges and came forward with a certainty that had long been their shield. Boone met them with rifle ready, the barrel, a dark, blunt promise in the new Sunday. There were no long words, only the quick, decisive geometry of a fight. Muzzles flashed, shots cracked, and men dropped into the dust. The deputies fell fast. Their surprise ended quickly. Boone felt recoil in his shoulder and the weight of every shot as both sentence and absolution. Rourke pressed through smoke, denial a mask. For a bitter second, Boone glimpsed the friend who had once been his brother in arms. Clay staggered, and when he fell he did not curse. His lips shaped a single ragged syllable: Boone, an imploring sound that landed inside Boone like cold iron. There was no room for mercy at that morning's edge. Rourke's breath left him slow and final, and the dust closed like a lid. Lena cried out, small and sharp. The woman on the cot sucked in a breath and held it as if life itself were a fragile, newly gained shore. Boone sank to his knees, hands gritty with blood and dust, the cost of the choice settling heavy as iron. He drew the child close, feeling the tiny body tremble, and in that pressed, shuddering space he understood the depth of what had been done. The town watched from windows on the ridge, faces pale and mouths closed. The story would run ahead of them in 100 versions, but here in the yard the reckoning at dawn had been short, brutal, and final. Boone knew the price would follow: whispers, enemies, perhaps vengeance, but he also felt a small, impossible lift. For the first time in years, the shape of the man he would have to be was clear in the child he held. For a long moment the prairie itself seemed to hold its breath. A hawk wheeled high and called, its cry raw and singular as if pronouncing verdict. Boone pressed his forehead to Lena's hair and let out a sound like an apology. He rose slowly, knowing the town would not forgive or forget, but feeling for the first time a resolve hard to stand on. He would protect these small lives or die the attempt. The sun rose over Dry Creek like a wound torn open in the sky, its crimson light bleeding across the dust and scrub, painting everything in the color of reckoning. Boone stood on his porch, hat in hand, boots heavy with mud and memory, staring out at the still horizon where the desert met the dawn. Behind him, the woman he'd saved lay on a cot by the fire, pale but breathing, her fingers clutching his as though afraid he might vanish like all the good things in her life had. The little girl slept beside her, her small chest rising steady, her face soft in the glow of the morning, safe for the first time in too long. The quiet of the house was foreign to Boone. No gunfire, no curses, no running horses in the night, just the creak of old boards and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. He should have felt peace, but instead there was a weight pressing down on him heavier than any bullet he'd ever taken. Mercy, he realized, carried its own kind of price. Somewhere out there, beyond the edge of the light, men would already be riding men who'd find the trail he'd left, the bodies he'd buried, the woman he'd stolen from their cruelty. Boone knew their kind. He used to ride with them, used to wear that same brand of darkness like a second skin. The memory of those days flickered like heat lightning behind his eyes. Towns burned, innocents left for dead, justice traded for gold. He had told himself for years that walking away had wiped his slate clean, that solitude and silence were enough penance for the sins of his youth. But last night had proved otherwise. The woman's screams had torn through his resolve, through the years of hiding and forgetting. He'd stepped into the fire again, and in doing so, burned away the last of the coward he'd become. The shotgun leaned against the porch rail beside him, cold and oiled, ready. Boone didn't want another fight, but he knew one was coming. You couldn't kill the past, it always came back, fangs bared and hungry. He thought of the sheriff, of the bounty posters still nailed to saloon walls with his name half faded, of the price men put on redemption when they didn't believe in it. He took a breath, slow and hard, tasting the grit in the air. Maybe they'd come by noon, maybe by sundown, maybe not at all. But if they did, they'd find Boonehart still standing. Not the outlaw who ran, not the ghost who hid in the hills, but the man who'd finally drawn a line worth dying for. Behind him, the woman stirred and whispered his name, a sound soft as prayer, and for the first time in years, Boone felt something close to peace. The sun climbed higher, washing the land in gold, and though he knew the blood would come again before the day was done, Boone didn't flinch. He'd made his choice. Mercy had its price, and he was ready to pay it. Days later, when the dust finally settled and the smell of gunpowder faded from the air, the townsfolk found Rourke's body buried on the edge of Boonehart's land, a simple mound of dirt marked only by a wooden cross without a name. The grave sat quiet beneath the open sky, where the wind hummed like a hymn through the prairie grass, carrying whispers back to Dry Creek. No one asked how it happened, and Boone didn't offer a story. Folks knew enough by the silence in his eyes when he came to town for supplies, by the faint bruise along his jaw and the blood he hadn't quite managed to wash from his shirt cuffs. Rourke had been the kind of man people feared, built like a bear, mean as a storm, and cruel for sport, but now he was just another ghost swallowed by the desert. Some said Boone buried him himself before dawn, digging into the cold earth until his hands bled, muttering prayers for a man who deserved none. Others claimed they'd heard gunfire that night, that a fire burned out on the horizon, that the coyotes howled a dirge long after midnight. Whatever the truth, something in Dry Creek changed. The saloon grew quieter. Men who once spat Boone's name in contempt now tipped their hats when he passed. The whispers that followed him weren't of the outlaw who'd run from his past, but of the giant rancher who'd faced down evil and spared the innocent. He saved them, folks said, voices low but steady. Saved that woman and her girl. And though no one dared speak Rourke's name again, everyone felt the shift, fear turning to reverence, hatred giving way to something like respect. Boone didn't care for any of it. He kept to his land, fixing fences, tending his horses, patching the bullet holes in his porch rail one by one. The woman and her daughter stayed a while, long enough for the girl's laughter to fill the empty spaces of the ranch, long enough for Boone to remember what life sounded like before regret had made him hollow. Sometimes, in the evenings, he'd sit beneath the setting sun, its fire bleeding across the plains, and listen to her laughter echo through the golden grass. It stirred something inside him he'd thought long dead, a quiet ache that wasn't pain, but peace. He didn't think of legends or redemption, though both now wore his face in the town's imagination. He thought of mercy, and how it had cost him everything yet given him back something better than forgiveness: purpose. As the days rolled on, Dry Creek began to heal in small, invisible ways. The lawmen stopped chasing ghosts. The townsfolk spoke softer, worked harder, and looked one another in the eye again. Out past Boone's ranch, the grave weathered under sun and rain, nameless but not forgotten. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, Folks swore they could hear the faint sound of a man's deep laugh rolling across the plains, like even the dead knew that mercy, once given, never truly dies.